conducting his very first funeral. And in searching for just the right thing to say to the mourners gathered in the congregation, he looked down into the casket, and as his eyes came up to the audience, he said these very comforting words. What we have here is only a shell. The nut has already gone. The sentiment was right on target. He knew what he was intending to communicate, but what happened? The words didn't fit. It wasn't what he probably would have said had he had the chance to back up, do a retake, and get to say it again. My guess is he would have chosen different words. That young preacher was the victim of not enough preparation and not very well organized thoughts. Would you agree on that? I don't want that to happen to you when you give a presentation. And so in this session, we're going to focus on the things that you can do before you ever get in touch with your audience, before you're ever standing in front of an audience, or before you ever enter the team meeting, what kinds of things you can do to improve the preparation that you do. And we'll also take a look then at, once you've done that preparation, how you take all that work that you've done, because there will be a lot of it, and how you organize it and structure it into a powerful presentation. And I'll give you some ideas on a variety of types of presentations, how you can take your research and structure that material appropriately. And then finally, before we finish this section, we'll touch on the subject of one other element of preparation that also starts with a P. It's called practice. And I'll give you some suggestions on how you can make practice a far more effective time spent out of your busy day. Preparation is a key to having a good, powerful presentation. There's no doubt about that. And so in terms of preparation, there are a number of things that you can be thinking about, that you can be doing in advance of giving your presentation. The first thing that I would suggest, and sometimes this goes without thinking, but other times you really need to check it off the list, determine or find out or discover what is your topic. Now that should seem to go without saying, right? But have you ever been asked to either give a presentation or be on the agenda of a meeting and the person says, this is kind of what we were thinking, and that's all the guidance you get? Ask that person to be a little more specific. Know your topic. Now if you're selecting your own topic, force it on yourself. Find out what you want to talk about. So determine clearly what your topic is. You can't go on a directed path forward if you don't know where you're starting, so know what your topic is. Assuming that's been done, you need to answer a question. You need to find out, either from the person who gave you the assignment or from yourself if you're working on it, what is the purpose of this presentation? Because determining the purpose determines where you go in the research. You can't just go out and research unless you know why you're researching. Most presentations fall into three types or three purposes. Yours will probably fall into one of these. One is to inform. That's the presentation, like a new employee orientation perhaps, where you're just giving information. You just want people to get the information, and they will have done their job, you will have done yours. Another variation on purpose is the speech or the presentation designed to entertain. To entertain an audience, to give them a good time. For example, a keynote presentation or an after-dinner speech would be purposes for entertaining. The third purpose is to persuade, and this is the one that most of you use most of the time in business. Persuading is when you want to convince the boss you need a day off. That's the little kind. Or the big one where you're making a big sales presentation. That's obviously a presentation for the purpose of persuasion. So first you find out your topic, and then once you know your topic, you determine, what am I trying to do with this topic? Where am I trying to go? What's the purpose of my presentation? To inform, to entertain, or to persuade? And that gives you a sense of where you go next. Before you go do any other research, there are a few more questions you need to ask yourself. You need to look inward. And the first question to ask yourself is this: why am I the one speaking? Why am I the person who's giving this presentation? If someone else asked you and you were invited to give that presentation, they probably had a reason for selecting you. Maybe you're the only one who'd say yes, that might be it, but probably there's something more specific that they were hoping you would do. Find out why you're the one speaking. If you've put yourself on the agenda, determine, why did I do that? Why am I the person who's going to be giving this presentation? Second question to ask yourself: what do I know on this topic? What's already in my head? Now, I would suggest when you ask this question, you have a legal pad handy, because ideas will start coming, and you want to capture them now so you don't have to redo this step later. So what do I know on this particular topic? Think it through, figure it out, and write it down on a legal pad. Now, keep the legal pad handy, because here's the third question you need to ask yourself. What experiences have I had related to this subject? Not just what do I know, but what experiences have I had on this subject? If you're going to give a sales presentation, what experiences have you had with the product is one of the first places you start. If you're going to be giving a team meeting presentation, what experiences have you had related to the subject you're giving in that team meeting? So ask yourself that question, and again, keep the legal pad handy, because hopefully lots of ideas will start coming. And we'll come back to that point in a moment. I'll show you what you do with those ideas. Then the fourth question to ask yourself is, what don't I know? What do I need to find out? Because until you've asked that question, research is not a good idea. You'll be researching randomly. You need to research specifically. So why am I the person giving the presentation? What do I know about this topic? What experiences have I had related to this topic, and what don't I know? What do I need to go somewhere else to find out? Now, the next step is not researching. You're not ready quite yet, because there's two parts to this presentation equation, and we've only looked at one of them. We've looked at you. You know what the other part of that equation is? It's your audience. And so before you begin any further research, you need to find out about your audience. Here are some things that I would suggest you try to discover about your audience. First of all, what are they expecting? What have they been told is going to happen? What do they know about you? What have they been told about you? Knowing what they think the topic is and what they think the purpose is a really important step, because if that doesn't match what you think the topic is and what you think the purpose is, you won't be a powerful presenter. You won't meet your audience's expectations. So find out, what are they expecting? Here's another biggie. Find out what they know. We've already talked about what you know, but you need to find out, what does your audience know? Have you been sitting in that presentation where just a few minutes into it you begin to think, where did the speaker come from? We just did this last week in another meeting. Or we had big training on this just a month ago. Or I've always known this. Why are we talking about it? That's a speaker who didn't take time to find out what his or her audience already knew. So you don't want to find yourself standing in front of an audience sharing information that's old news. So find out about your audience. What are they expecting? What do they think you're going to be discussing? And what do they expect from you? What are they expecting that you're going to share with them? And they hope it's new information. So find out what they already know. Now, at long last, you're ready to begin doing the research. You know the topic, you know some things about yourself, you know some things about your audience. Here are some things I would suggest to focus on when you go out and you begin your research. Number one, and it should be obvious, but I think we need to say it anyway, go to the library. Go to the library. Talk to the reference librarian. Those people can give you wonderful help in finding material for your subject. Some of us kind of get away from that library thing once school's over with, and it's hard to get ourselves back into the library. Go to the library. That's a wonderful place to do research. But there are other places you need to go as well. I would suggest to you that the media is an excellent place to go for doing research. Here's some different things to look for. Watch TV. Maybe that's not a habit of yours, but occasionally watch TV and watch some of those news magazines and places where you can pick up interesting stories and interesting quotations. So watch TV, watch documentaries. That's where you get good historical information that you can add to your presentation, and you get people's opinions. So watch TV, listen to the radio, especially talk radio, public radio. Not just go listen to your favorite country music. That's not going to help you. Listen to the radio where there's news reports and talk radio, people calling in. You can pick up wonderful human interest type things. You'll also want to be reading magazines. And you may focus pretty much on magazines in your area and your technical field, but I would suggest that for the purpose of building a library of good information to do research from, look at magazines more of human interest, people interest type magazines. So you can find out the warm fuzzy stories or the occasional funny thing that a kid does that applies to what a manager does in business, and can make those analogies. So research in the magazines. You also need to be taking a specific focus on the kind of media that's important to the people in your audience. If you're giving a presentation to an audience that has a technical specialty and there's a journal or a newsletter that those people take on a regular basis, you need to at least get yourself a copy of the most recent edition. If not, subscribe and get some copies coming your way so you can get a good sense of what is my audience reading. What information will they think is relevant? So look for newsletters and journals and magazines related to your audience as well. There's another type of magazine, there's another type of newsletter that I would suggest you also look for. And this is the kind that's put out just for speakers. Have you seen some of these? They're just full of quotations or great stories, and they're indexed by different topics. If you don't have something like that, first go look at some, but then I'd suggest you own a few copies as well. At a minimum, get a quotation book. Because even if you never give a formal, big presentation from a script, even just in a team meeting, if you drop a little quotation in that just hits right on the mark, you'll make a good impression. So I would suggest you need to own a quotation book if you don't already. Another place to go for research you may not have thought of is the internet. Go researching online. Go places where you can find a wealth of information and not have to go anywhere. You don't have to drive to the library. You don't have to involve another person. Research on the internet. Another place I would suggest that you research, and sometimes this is overlooked, but to be completely honest, I think the people who do this give far more powerful presentations. Go out and interview people like the people in your audience. Interview people and get research there. Think about how much time it takes you to read a magazine compared to how much time it takes just to talk to a person and have them share a few things with you. It's far more efficient to talk to another person than to read through volumes of material hoping to get something. If you can go to a person and say, tell me what it's like, and they tell you what it's like, think how much more efficient that is. And then when you stand in front of your audience, you can say, just yesterday, or if you procrastinate, or if you prepare, just a few weeks ago, I was talking with so-and-so, and here's what he had to say on this subject. That's information no one else could bring to that presentation because you went out and got it yourself. I think it's a wonderful step to add power to your presentations. I have an associate who was given the task of speaking to a group of records management professionals. Do you know what that means? It means they file. Their job is filing. She didn't have a strong background in that. And records management is a whole field of study. And so in preparation for that, she decided, among other things, to do some interviews. And she went right to doctor's office and dentist office. Because have you seen their filing systems? They're huge. They're complex, and you just can't misplace someone's medical records. That's not a good thing. It's critical to be able to go right to the information, and it's a very complex filing system. So she went out to doctor's office and dentist's office and said, tell me what it's like. What do you experience? What are your frustrations? What is it that stops up the process? What have you discovered that works really well? And then you know what she got to do? She got to stand in front of her audience and give real, live examples from people who on a daily basis are working in records management. Some experience that she hasn't had, she shared other people's experience. So interview, go out and talk to not just your audience, but people who are like your audience. Here's another place to go do research. Go to your card file. Yes, some of you are saying, what's a card file? Others of you are saying, I don't have a card file. So if you don't have one, step number one is create one. It's very easy to do. All you do is take a recipe box or an index card filing system. Think of 5 or 6 topics that are general topics that relate something to what you do every day. Maybe you'll have a topic on supervision, one on leadership, one on communication skills, one on negotiation. Those are just some samples. And index a file in that manner. Then when you do your research and you run across a good tidbit, a good story or a quotation or a powerful statistic, either cut it out or write it down on an index card and put it in the file. Now you can do that when you're researching, but I do it all the time. If I'm on an airplane and I pick up a magazine and I read an interesting article, you know, you get to keep those copies. So I take it with me, I rip that thing out when I get home, put it in the card file. Anytime you run across anything interesting, watching a TV show you may hear a strong quotation, write it down and get it in your card file. Think how quickly you can research good information if when you're assigned to give a presentation, you just go to a card file, thumb through, and you pull out a great quotation. You didn't have to do any extensive research to do that. Now, if you're really into the card file, let me tell you something else you might consider doing. Recently, I took my card file and put it on a computer database. And in doing that, it allows me to use it much more effectively. What I'm able to do is identify what kind of information is in that particular entry. So everything's labeled either as a statistic or a quotation or a story, something like that. And then I give it 2 subheadings. One subheading is the major heading. It might be communication skills. And then there's a next heading, a minor subheading. It might be handling aggressive people. And then there's the story. So I go to the computer and I say, I really need a story about handling aggressive people when you're trying to communicate. Tick, 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 and there it is. There's the story. Now, you don't have to create a computer database in order to have a card file. It's just variations on a theme. But you need to have something like that where you've captured the good things you've already accomplished. If you use a good quotation in this presentation, chances are there's another presentation further in your future where that quotation will also fit. Don't let it disappear once that speech is finished. Put it into your card file. So those are some places that you can go to get additional research for your presentation. Once you've done all of that, you're now at the position to begin organizing the material. And my hope is that when you do this research, you have a wealth of information. And again, I want to emphasize this isn't just research because you're giving a speech to 1,000 people in a big auditorium. This may be research to give a presentation to one other person to persuade a supervisor that you need a software upgrade. You'll still want to do this kind of research and do as many of these elements as you can. So let's assume then you've done the work. You've been out in the field, you've gotten the information, you've been on the computer, you've surfed the net, you've done all those things, and you have the information. What do you do with it? Well, you first need to determine what format you want to put the information in. So let's talk about how you can structure your information. We'll begin by looking at the introduction of a presentation and the conclusion of a presentation, and then we'll focus more on what comes in the middle, the body of the presentation. Do you remember way back in junior high when you were writing papers? And your teacher said to you, a good paper has 3 parts. It has an introduction, it has a body, and then it has a concluding paragraph. And it was really simple to write a 1-page paragraph. That exact same thing applies to every presentation you give. It's not just pick out when do you do it, it applies to every presentation you give. It applies to a one-on-one spontaneous conversation in many cases. It applies to a team meeting. You'll need to give a preview, and then you'll give the body, and then you'll give a conclusion. Any presentation you give. It applies also regardless of time length. If you're giving a 5-minute presentation, it better have those 3 parts. If you're giving a week-long training program, it better have those 3 parts. So let's look first at the introduction, the beginning of your presentation. There are several things that a good introduction needs to do, but the first thing, the very first thing that your good introduction needs to do is reach out and grab your audience's attention, because you may not have it to begin with. Assume that you don't, so reach out and grab your audience's attention. How do you do that? You deliver something unexpected. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's not unexpected. That doesn't grab attention. I enjoy so much the topic of XYZ. That isn't going to grab anyone's attention. So begin with something unexpected. For example, I teach a 3-day class for trainers. It's designed to train trainers. And here's how I begin that class. I begin it with a quotation by Wayne Gretzky, who's never been a trainer. He's a hockey player, if you haven't heard of him. Wayne Gretzky's a hockey superstar. And here's why I begin that presentation with Wayne Gretzky. Because Wayne Gretzky was once asked to what he attributed his success in hockey. Why is he so good? And here's what he said. I never focus on where the puck is. I always focus on where the puck is going to be, and that's where I'm in position. So I made it very clear to the people in that class that the purpose of what we're going to do in the next 3 days is to help them quit focusing on where the puck is and focus on where it's going to be, and that's how they can be better trainers. That's how we began the presentation. They didn't walk into the room expecting to learn anything about hockey, but that's where it began. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak to a group of salespeople. And that presentation, it was a 1-day training class, and in that presentation I began with this thought by Jim Rohn. Jim Rohn said that we all experience the same wind. It's the set of the sails that makes the difference. Now think about it for salespeople. This group of people have essentially the same customer base. They work with essentially the same products, but if you look at the statistics, the results are radically different. Why? Well, they have all the things, the wind is the same, the sales, products, the customers, but the results are different. It's how they've set their sales. And that's how we began that presentation for those salespeople. I'll tell you in a moment how that presentation ended. So begin with something unexpected. Reach out, grab their attention. Next thing you'll want to do somewhere in the beginning, somewhere in your introduction, is gain the audience's trust in you. Establish your credibility. You know why you're up here, because remember, you're going to be saying things to yourself at the beginning of the presentation that you're here for a purpose. You know what that purpose is. So tell your audience why they should listen to you. In other words, what credibility do you bring to the room? And establish that. You need to do it briefly. They'll get bored if you give them too much of that kind of information. And we've already talked about reaching out and grabbing the interest, but keep in mind how fleeting that is. I can use a great quotation or a startling statistic, or I can tell you a funny story, and you'll be interested for just a blip in time. So beyond just reaching out and grabbing attention, the next thing you want to do is gain your audience's interest. Do you see the distinction? Grabbing attention and gaining interest. Two totally different things. How do you gain an audience's interest quickly in the introduction of your presentation? It's very simple. You sell them on the concept. You give them benefits. What's in it for you? By being here today, by being a part of this presentation, you'll gain X, you'll gain Y, and you'll gain Z. And suddenly they're thinking, I'm glad I'm here. Because you've given them what's in it for them. Not how happy you are to be here, how happy you are they're here because of the benefits that they're going to gain. So gain their interest by telling them what's in it for them. What kinds of advantages will they experience by being here? When you say, we'll talk about this, this, and this, that isn't nearly as powerful as saying, you'll learn how to do this, or you'll gain new information on this, or you'll have a complete understanding of this. That's more powerful. So you've reached out, you've grabbed their interest, grabbed their interest and gained their attention and done all of those things to establish yourself to give a good presentation. But here are a couple of things to keep in mind about that introduction before you move forward. The best introductions in the world are short. They don't take very much time. What do you communicate when you give a lengthy introduction to an audience? You communicate, I don't respect your time. I'm just going to say what comes to my mind, and we may be here all day if that's what it takes. That's essentially the message you're sending. So a short introduction. Next step, it also needs to be fast-paced. It needs to pass by quickly, not just short in length, but also in how quickly the information comes. It needs to be a very fast-paced introduction. Why? Again, ask yourself, what message are you sending with a slow-paced introduction? You're saying, we'll get through it. It'll take a while. I'm not all that excited. You probably shouldn't be either. And it's taking you a while to get there, so a fast-paced introduction. The final thing that good introductions do, good introductions give your audience a roadmap for the rest of the presentation. They say, here we are, here's where we're ending, here's how we're going to get there. In other words, if you want it explicitly, my 3 points are 1, 2, 3. Now you won't say it that way, but that's what you're telling your audience. Look out, here's the direction we're going. Why is this important? Well, first of all, it makes sure you know where you're going. It gives them confidence that there is a plan. But second, as you progress through those points of your presentation, they stay with you, and they know where it's headed. So your introduction needs to be short, it needs to be fast-paced, it needs to grab attention, it needs to gain interest to be a powerful introduction. Let's move from the beginning of your presentation to the very end of your presentation. I've heard it once said that a speech is a whole lot like a love affair. Any fool can begin one, but to end one takes considerable skill. I think that's true. Conclusions are the last thing on your audience's mind. They may have heard a wonderful presentation, and in the last 5 minutes, you can blow it. There's some pressure. So what you do in the last few minutes of your presentation is critical. Now, the good news is this. A good conclusion looks a whole lot like a good beginning. The things you did in the introduction just need to flip-flop and find themselves in the conclusion. Just like you sold the audience on why they were going to get good things that day in your introduction, now it's the conclusion. And you remind them of all the good things they got during that presentation. Even if it's a 10-minute presentation, all the good things that they received during that presentation. So it just mirrors the introduction. And just as you gave them a roadmap for the day in the beginning, when they get to the end, give them a view backwards, where we've been, the things that we've accomplished today, or in this session, or in this week-long training class. So you do the same things in the conclusion that you did in the opening. Here's one more thing I would suggest. I think the best openings go right back to the very beginning. The very first thing you did to grab that audience's attention, finish on that same point. It worked once, why not use it again, right? So at the end of your presentation, go back to the beginning. It makes a very nice bow that you can tie on the package that you're leaving them with that day. For example, I gave you an example earlier of a training class that I deliver, a 3-day training class. We begin that with Wayne Gretzky, remember? So at the conclusion of that class, the last thing after 3 days of working together that those trainers hear, they hear about a hockey puck. And they hear about where the hockey puck is and where the hockey puck's going, and I remind them of the importance of focusing on where the hockey puck is going to be, and I can remind them once again, they now possess the skills to stay focused here, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be the top trainers in their field. And it has everything to do with the hockey puck. That sales presentation, or giving the presentation to the salespeople that I mentioned earlier, start the presentation with the quotation from Jim Rohn about the set of the sails, and we all experience the same wind. That presentation ends on the same theme, but with a different quotation. When I finished that presentation, I shared with them this thought. The pessimist always complains about the wind. The optimist hopes someday the wind will change. But the realist goes about the task of setting the sails. And as I look around the room of salespeople I see in front of me today, I hope there are no pessimists here. And if you're an optimist, that's a good thing, but I want you to transform that into being a realist, because you can't complain about the wind. You can't hope it will change. If you want to be the top of your field in sales, if you want to break sales records, you need to be about the business of resetting the sales, and now you have the skills to do that. And that's how the presentation ended, right back where it began. So the best conclusions conclude just as the presentation began. That's a little bit about the introduction and the ending of a presentation. But as we know, there's a significant portion we skipped over. So let's back up for a moment and look at the body of a good presentation. My grandmother sent me a quotation not long ago that she'd cut out of one of her magazines. And the quotation was this: if you want to have a really great speech, have a good beginning and a good ending and put them as close together as possible. I haven't yet determined if she sent that to me for my own edification or if it was for the purpose of sharing with others like yourself. But I'm sharing it with you because I think it points to the value of letting the body of your presentation be powerful. It's not just the time where you get to check all the things off your list and you keep talking till you get to the end. It has to be structured very powerfully. The first step in having a strong body of a presentation, again, short, long, formal, informal, it doesn't matter, is to decide on the format. There are several formats that most presentations fall into. One format is simply to group your information topically. You take the things that seem to fit together naturally and you put them together, and those form your main points. For example, this presentation, this session, this material is gathered and constructed topically. We're talking about preparation, introductions and closings, the body of your presentation, and practice. It's just putting together information that's similar. That's one way you may want to structure the body of your presentation. Another way you may want to consider is chronological. A comes first, then B, then C, then D. And those are the 4 points. This presentation could have been done that way. If we'd talked about introductions, then bodies, then conclusions, that would have been a chronological presentation. So there's another variation. Many presentations in business either fall into this third category or they should have and didn't, and that's why they didn't work. Here's the third category: problem, solution. Have you experienced one of those or delivered one of those? It sounds like this. Here's the issue. Here's the solution to that issue. Here's another problem we're experiencing. Here's the solution to that problem. So here's point 1 and here's point 2. Maybe there's a third problem, a third solution. There's point 3. Or you can take that same structure and use this variation. There's 2 points. One is the problem. Point number 1 is here's the issue. Here's what we're dealing with. Point number 2, here's the solution that you present. Now, if you use the problem solution format, there's a way to take it one step higher in terms of effectiveness, to make it just slightly more powerful, and here's what it is. After you give the problem, you give the solution, and then you give what we'll call the visualization. And this is the point where you say, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's what would happen if this solution were adopted. You see how powerful that is? Now, you can also tweak this as well. And here's what would happen